Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Azad in Focus, a segment of Azad Awaaz. We are a monthly patrika that focuses on the marginalized sections of society whose voices are often lost or unheard in the cacophony of mainstream media discourse. When referring to marginalized communities, we try to not restrict ourselves to the traditional focus on social aggregates like caste and race, but we aspire to talk about subjects like class, gender identity, and environmentalism as well. In this month's edition of Azad in Focus, we would like to address the Naxalite movement in central India as a response to the marginalization that these tribal communities have faced. There has been a lot of debate as to whether the Naxalite movement is a legitimate response to the oppression, the systematic exploitation, indeed, of the Adivasi communities, or whether these violent actors represent a significant threat to national security and should be dealt with as such. Um, in this conversation, we would like to address the objectives of the movement and the inequalities faced by the Adivasis, which have driven them into the arms of the Naxalites. We would also like to address the state's response to the movement, which essentially has been overwhelming military force and caused a lot of suffering amongst the Adivasis as a result. Today, I have with me Professor Kishalay Bhattacharjee. Professor Bhattacharjee is the Dean of Journalism at the OP Jindal Global University. He is a very distinguished journalist himself and the former resident editor of NDTV, who has reported widely from India's conflict zones for 2 decades now. He's also the founder and curator of Art East, a festival of art and livelihood annually at the India International Center in Delhi, and has received many awards in journalism, including the Ramnath Goenka Excellence in Journalism Award. He has written numerous books on this topic, and the one that we would like to be discussing today is his book, The Unfinished Revolution. Thank you very much, Professor Bhattacharya, for agreeing to have this conversation with us. To start things off, your book, The Unfinished Revolution, was based on 2 rounds of fieldwork in the Koraput and Mangalpuri regions of Odisha, which have been afflicted by Naxalite insurgencies. So, could you tell us a little bit about your personal experiences and observations in these conflict-torn regions of India?
Job was to basically go and cover areas which are disturbed areas and conflict areas. But there was 1 year I was on a sabbatical at the Institute for Defense Studies, and journalists don't usually get that luxury of doing field research. We are on the ground running mostly. And I chose, Koraput and Malkangiri because those were areas which were called Maoist affected areas. Also, that was the time when Operation Green Hunt was going on. The Maoist insurgency was considered to be the gravest internal security threat, within quotes, by the government, the highest level. Each year, the prime minister's meeting with the chief ministers, this would be underlined. The gravest internal security would be the Maoist threat. And strangely enough, there wasn't much happening from the government's end to be able to either mitigate or to be able to address the concerns. And then when Mr. Chidambaram became the home minister, then this Green Hunt started, which was controversial, to say the least. But I was actually concerned about the whole, history of the Maoist movement, or the Naxalite movement, as we call it. And a lot of people wonder what is this word Naxalite, but for the uninitiated, basically it's just name of a village. And now a tea garden in Siliguri, actually just a little away from Siliguri in North Bengal. So it means nothing. I mean, it's not just a name of a village where the initial uprising took place, where a number of people died in police firing, and that is how it kind of spread. The history is not of one umbrella body that has actually gone through, half a century of what we call the Maoist movement. It was through splits and mergers of the main movement. which we see now. But I was more, I was curious to understand that, it's been almost half a century. I mean, who are these people right now? What do they do? What do they want? And but more specifically is that are all Maoists, are all all Maoists Adivasis? Probably yes, but are all Adivasis Maoists? No. And by then I was also working on how media, and I being a member of that, were responsible for stereotyping peoples and places, because for a long time you report from a place, and that's the nature of the beast, on a certain, particularly if this is a violent, if you're covering violence, then you're covering only violence from a particular place, right? And over 20 years, if you are going to report only violence from one area, then that area looks like trapped in some kind of a violence, and they just can't come out of it. So, Koraput, Malkangiri, Dantewada. I mean, these are places that people have associated only with the Maoist problem, as if nothing else exists out there. The similar was with Jammu and Kashmir, Leh and Ladakh, when it happened, and people forgot that Leh and Ladakh were even part of it, because no one reported from there, and everything was being reported from the Kashmir Valley, and it looked like the most violent place on earth. So, in order to try and address that curiosity in me, I had gone and done the fieldwork in Malkangiri and Koraput. I was my first encounter were multi-story martyrs tomb, and yes, these were the liberated zones. That I found multinational steel companies pumping stations, which was also very strange. And so my curiosity was even more to figure out, okay, what is this happening now? I mean, out here you are fighting against a certain system, but you are actually in cahoots with that system, or are you? And also to be able to address that stereotype. And quite not very surprisingly, it is a stereotype. Clearly, we all know that all Adivasis are not Maoists, but all Adivasis can be branded as Maoists in operations like Operation Green Hunt. So that was one of the first forays into that area. But soon, in a year's time, and that was 2011 when I went out there. In 2012, when I was back at NDTV where I used to work, I was suddenly, airdropped into Bhubaneswar from Calcutta, because that was the first international hostage crisis that we were facing. 2 Italian tourists were taken hostage by the Maoists in Kandhamal district of Odisha. And amongst the several television crews out there, I gained access into to the hostages. So went into the Maoist camp, and I suddenly realized that was a good peg around which I could tell the story of the 50 years of the CPI Maoist and all of the Maoist movement, really, through its splits and mergers, etc. And because that acted like a crucible around which I could weave the story. So yeah, have I answered your question? I'm not sure, but that was my reason for doing this book.
Right, Professor. Indeed, very interesting to learn about your motivations for this. Now, as you mentioned, the Maoist movement, it originated in Naxalite village in West Bengal, my home state, incidentally. So in the late 1960s, it was driven, or it is spearheaded by a cadre of urban intellectuals. Charu Majumdar comes to mind in this context. And in the 70s, it really rocked even a major urban center like Calcutta. Since then, however, the movement has shifted largely to the forests and jungles. I think most Indians today would associate Naxalites with forests. Only perhaps in Calcutta itself, there's a memory that they were once an urban guerrilla movement. So, why would you say that this shift has happened, and why have they been able to garner such widespread support amongst the Adivasis? Why do the Adivasis consider the Maoists as the ideology that can liberate them?
See, just to put it, correct you, the Adivasis don't consider the Maoists to be their ideology. Right? It would be certain parts, and unfortunately, those certain parts where the Maoists operate, in many of the areas, the Adivasis are the residents. The Adivasis provide the majority of cadres. Say, for example, the Maoists operate in the Gaya district. I mean, you don't have the Adivasis in the Gaya district of Bihar. Okay, so there are many areas. Also, Calcutta wasn't the only urban center where the Naxalite movement, the Naxalite movement at that point of time in the late 60s, early 70s had great seduction. So you had even Delhi University, in many urban centers, students were attracted to this idea of revolution and they joined, but I don't think so. It was a sustainable idea in the urban centers, and it quickly got diffused, and of course, at the cost of gross human rights violations, unleashed by the then government, and then the Chief Minister Siddharth Shankar Rai, who later became the governor in Punjab when the Punjab killings were happening. There are, in fact, the first documentation of human rights abuse of state encounters were in West Bengal. And the book before this that I had written called Blood on My Hands, Confessions of Staged Encounters, I document all those human rights abuses that had happened during the Naxalite era. Along the Ganga, there would be makeshift, cremation grounds, and at night the police would come and dump bodies, and their comrades or their families would actually quickly burn them, and their names would be written in charcoal on the wall out there, and there isn't any real documentation of that. It is an unfortunate era of conspiracy of silence that, particularly in Bengal, where people seem to have forgotten those dark days, and not so long ago. It did not happen 100 years ago, you see. It was in recent past. I mean, I have memory of that. So, and almost every household would have out there a story around that. And since that kind of broke, the movement really gave away for some time. And when the Maoists in various different avatars got together in various formations, so they were not one any longer. You see, because Charu Mazumdar had gone, Kanu Sanyal had retired as in, he wasn't in the thick of things really any longer, because the movement received a very bad jolt. And in fact, just there's only one surviving member of the original uprising in Siliguri and Naxalbari called Shanti Munda. So if anyone visits Naxalbari, you can go and meet Shanti Munda. She seems still fit enough to fight another battle. But that was the time they reorganized themselves in Bihar, in Odisha, in the forests of Jangal Mahal, in various other areas, and then found a safe haven later through Chhattisgarh into the Dantewada forest. Dantewada is a thick forested area. They found natural refuge out there. Also, the movement there was a different under the same umbrella, but different leadership was happening around Andhra. Andhra took over the leadership. Now, this is a fascinating. My book really travels. You asked me about how they, from a city, it moved to the forest. That was basically Now, I asked Abhijit Mazumdar, Charu Mazumdar's son, who teaches English in Siliguri and who is a member of the CPI ML now, which is not banned, that did Charu Babu and the Maoists, did they have the Adivasis in mind? when they launched this movement, that we will become the mouthpiece of the voiceless, of the most exploited, of the marginalized people? Or was it by accident? They think that it was only an accidental encounter. I think otherwise. I think, originally, even if originally it was not the plan, but I think later they realized that these are the pockets where they could consolidate themselves, because these are the areas where these people had no representatives in so-called mainstream, and they became their representative. But I argue that while becoming their representative, they actually were doing exactly what they were fighting against. They were also exploiting the Adivasis in a different way.
Right, Professor. So, would it be perhaps fair to say that the Adivasis were people in need of an ideology, and the Maoist leaders had an ideology, but they needed a mass base for that, and so it was a kind of confluence of those two factors?
Yeah, except it wasn't. I wouldn't use the word Adivasis, because Adivasis would encompass a large population. So it would be only in certain pockets. They even know about the Maoist ideology. They don't know about the Maoist ideology. I went to the Maoist camp where I stayed. My bodyguard, a girl called Rebecca, would attend church twice a week. So clearly, they are not married to the Maoist ideology, but they were fighting for survival. They were fighting for they were simply fighting for their right to life. But I am arguing that even the Maoists were not ready to grant them right for life, because the Maoists carried out the kangaroo court justice. The Maoists would exploit women. The Maoists, the whole contradiction among the Maoists is that the Politburo was still the upper caste, and the entire cadre was the Adivasis or others. They did not even the token have an Adivasi in the Politburo. The leadership was making money allegedly, and these are all that is in the book and told to me by a leader. So it is the Maoist commander who is saying that the Maoist leaders are making all the money. There was a compulsory drafting from each family into the cadres. Now that's exploitation. That's gross exploitation. And I was, when I was with the Maoist commander, I asked him, I said, even as a demo, as an example, in 50 years, have you developed one village in the entire? And his answer to that, of course, was that this is the first stage of revolution. Now, for 50 years, you're still having the first stage of revolution. I don't know where your second stage and third stage is going to lead you to. So, there was this inherent, there are many contradictions. The Maoist movement went through all these contradictions and continues to be where it is. That's why, it is, something that I had written, I remember, was that, in all these districts across wherever we talk about the Maoist districts, and, when just addressing your question of ideology, they have the poorest indicators for health, education, nutrition, sanitation, and therefore the human rights deficit was particularly high in these districts. And all these districts had high concentration of Adivasis and sometimes of Dalits, which is not often mentioned. Quite a few had something else in common. There was a remarkable overlap in these districts with their human rights deficit and those identified by the ministry as completely under Maoist sway. So it's, the number of districts that were identified as with these low indicators also were under the Maoist sway. So it is hard for someone, as you mentioned, not to conclude then that one has led to the other, that the Maoists were the product and the beneficiaries of years of neglect of areas and segments of India's population that actually needed greatest nurturing. Unfortunately, the areas that required the greatest care and nurturing are the most exploited and ignored. And that is why people extrapolate that, okay, these are the people who must be with the Maoists.
So one could say it's almost a chicken and egg problem in that does the neglect come first and then the Maoists, or are the Maoists the ones responsible for underdevelopment? And I would think the answer is a complicated mixture of those two factors.
I mean, no, I mean, it's not so complicated because the areas are neglected, and but the Maoists moved in there. Now, the Maoists consider that this is that this was accidental, that this was not part of their conspiracy or part of their plan. And I say that no, this was very much, this is how you work. There's a method in it, because you could not have done it in such an organized way across all the underdeveloped districts. But there was also another contradiction, that a fault line that runs through the red corridor, which is between the Adivasis and the Dalits. And and there's an expert group which had noted that both are put upon by the upper caste and are the natural constituency for the Maoists. But just like in the United States, right at the pile you have the Hispanics and the blacks, but the Hispanics are below the blacks. So similarly out here, the Dalits, the Adivasis are below the Dalits. There is a caste hierarchy as well, and the Maoists are very aware of this caste hierarchy. We tend to forget the caste dynamics.
Right, Professor. I think there was even a Ramchandra Guha article which I used as a research basis for this month's edition, which really talked about the caste dynamics. So they find that very interesting. Moving on to another aspect of this discussion. I'm sure you have witnessed at firsthand the government's response to the Maoist problem, which has been some form of military response. You mentioned Operation Green Hunt. And I think it's very well documented that in a large number of cases, in a large number of regions, the government's response has been excessive, right? If we think about something like the Salva Judum, it's an entirely paramilitary organization. So would you say that the government's response, legitimate is not the term I will use because I don't think there can be any question as to its legitimacy, but was it needed, or was there any better way that you could have gone about things? Or was violence the only answer to violence?
Clearly not. I mean, clearly it just went awry. I mean, the way it was played out, and you're playing, people against people. You played, friend against friend, brother against brother, and the results are for all to see. That those areas continue to be the most underdeveloped areas. Those areas also, the tribal areas are in the country, whether in the east, northeast, or in the Maoist areas, as we call, though there is nothing called Maoist areas. I mean, there's not like some kind of a red flag corridor that is passing by. But these are areas which are very rich in mineral deposits and are waterheads. India is an energy-hungry country. India needs to mine its energy, and there is a direct conflict then with the people who live out there. The Constitution guarantees safeguards of these areas under the 5th and the 6th schedule, but the 5th schedule clearly, which applies to the Maoist areas, has been ignored by the government over the years. But very interestingly, before we come to the violence bit, in 2008, the Planning Commission had come out with a report called the Development Challenges in Extremist Affected Areas. And it said, in general, the contradiction between the tribal community and the state itself has become sharper, translating itself into open conflict in many areas, almost all over the tribal areas, and it goes to mention, etc. Tribal people seem to feel a deep sense of exclusion and alienation. Now, these are words by the government of India. It went on to say, there is, however, a failure of governance. I'm not saying this. This is 2008 Planning Commission report. A failure of governance which has multiple dimensions and is not confined to the inefficiency of the delivery system only. It is not fortuitous that overwhelmingly large sections of bureaucracy / technocracy constituting the delivery system come from land-owning dominant castes or well-to-do middle classes with their attachment to ownership of property, cultural superiority, purity, pollution, governed behavior, and a state of mind which rationalizes and asserts their existing position of dominance in relation to others. So this report rots, unread, neglected, like the areas and the people to whose desperate plight it drew. What is required out there is governance. What is required out there is understanding what the ground situation out here and just fulfilling the normal needs for right to live. You do not need violence. I don't think so. Any Adivasi, and I can speak this responsibly, even within the Maoist cadres, and I can give you an example of how the Maoist commander, I quote him, who tells me that, if there was no state repression, we could not have hired a single cadre. The cadres do not join, and I repeat it, that cadres do not join the Maoist because of Chairman Mao. They do not understand what Marxism is. They join for survival. And this girl, Rebecca, name changed, what I am telling you, Rebecca's sister had joined the insurgency. So Rebecca's brother was taken, tortured, killed in a police station. Rebecca's father was taken there, tortured. Next, they came for Rebecca and she picked up the gun. I am not condoning violence by the Maoists. In fact, I am severely critical of the Maoists exploiting the Adivasis as well. But my empathy would be towards the Adivasis, and to be able to understand that it is nothing. Is that okay? You must understand all the caste dynamics and etc. But it is the simple question of governance, which has been underlined by the government of India's report.
Right. It would seem that the Indian government has embraced Harry Truman's dictum that if you grab them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. But I think we have seen in this instance and in insurgencies across the world that's not really the case. Professor, just for some closing comments, perhaps. You published your book, The Unfinished Revolution, in 2017. It's now 2023, almost 5 years have passed. And since then, the Naxalite movement has been resurgent in certain areas. Just last year, for example, the West Bengal government admitted that the movement is on the rise again in West Bengal. And there have also been reports, for example, of Naxalite presence in Madhya Pradesh, which was a state earlier largely unaffected by the insurgency. So what is your own view about how events have evolved since you published your book? And what do you think about the trajectory for the Adivasis? There have been developments like Draupadi Murmu was made president. So would that just be like something symbolic, or does that portend real positive change?
No, nothing will portend any positive change. I think the state repression has not gone down. The Maoist movement has been going through troughs and crests through 50 years. So I can't really see or even predict how they are going to survive or not survive over the next decade or so. Their presence in many of the areas that they dominated certainly has been on the wane. They are not organized enough. Their funding has diminished, and none of these guerrilla movements can survive really without enough funding, because you need to procure arms, and they do not have, as far as my information goes, that they are not well funded any longer. Picks up speed in some place. So now in Andhra Pradesh, I think the governments were complacent, but now Andhra and Telangana both. It was complacent because that was one area where they achieved a lot of success. Information says that that it's kind of raising its head out there again. Now that is one part. Since it has, its history says that it kind of manages to survive. but it will manage to survive in some form or the other as long as there is state repression. And state repression in underdeveloped areas, and particularly in the conflict areas, disturbed areas, is of a level that is almost unacceptable. And unless the government really applies its brakes out there, takes cognizance, emboldens and empowers the police force, because it is the police force which will have to take them on, if at all. It cannot be the paramilitary and the army force. And remember, it's again another one of those contradicting ironies, that in the area which you say is the gravest internal security threat of your country, you do not let the army operate, because you would be embarrassed that how can because those are the borders, and I need to secure my borders, not the people. The people can be killed and maimed and disappeared and tortured, but at least I have geographically secured my country. But in the heart, you don't need to geographically secure the country. So the army doesn't operate in the Maoist areas. So you have paramilitary forces operating all in a very military way. But I think it's more important for the police stations out there also to be empowered. They are in a decrepit situation. They need to be enabled, and that is one way of doing things. But the main way really is to be able to question, to be able to address the governance situation, the question of the medicine, healthcare, education. But the government, of course, will say that every time we set up a school, the Maoists come and burn it. Maoists destroy it, because the Maoists don't want. On the other hand, if there is a development, they come and destroy it, because they see that as that is something that the government will have to address. But I don't see the short answer to your after giving a long reply is that I think the movement is on the wane, and it is the right time then for the government to be able to address the other issues.
Right. I think it might be fair to say that paramilitary organizations operating outside the law can only apply coercion. Order can only be brought by organizations working within the ambit of the law, such as the police. And of course, as you rightly highlighted, the long-term answer to any insurgency is development. Right, Professor, today's conversation was genuinely fascinating. We explored the history of the movement, the dynamics of caste associated with it, the structural issues of the Maoists themselves, the contradictions inherent to their movement, and the unfortunate history of government repression against the Adivasis as well. I would thank you on behalf of Awaaz for taking out your valuable time to talk with us. And thank you everyone who's watching. That's it for this episode of Azad in Focus.
Thank you so much.